All right. We're going.
Yeah, and he's great.
Yeah, he's great too. He's great. Everything's great. Wow. Oh, yeah.
So we are all surviving. At least.
I hope that,
Just, you know.
What?
I was gonna say, I hope Dickie and AJ don't have COVID. It's, the new-
Well, is there like a
You
resurgence
have
of that?
back to school disease, so it could be anything.
Oh, yeah, right,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, the first week, everybody mixes germs, and so whatever's out there.
Yeah, Ajay and Dickie aren't gonna be coming today because they're sick.
Yeah.
So who knows? I don't know that they've been testing for anything.
Right,
particular,
they just
but-
weren't feeling well.
Yeah.
But I guess anybody who's been a teacher knows that her sister.
Oh, she always got
process
sick.
anyway.
Yeah.
The first 2 weeks of school, everybody was sick.
All right, let's start with the prayers. We're already past time. Okay. We want to go into explanations on these,
Right.
just go. All right,
Do it.
just do it. All right, taking refuge and generating bodhicitta. Sangye Jodam Sogi Chodnam La Jangchu Bardu Dagni Kyapsuchi Dagi Jinso Gipe Sonam Ki Rola Fenchir Sangye Druparsho Sangye Chodam Sogi Chodnam La Jangchu Bardu Dagni Kyapsuchi Dagi Jinso Gipe Sonam Ki Rola Tenchir Sangye Druparsho Sangye Chodam Sogi Chodnam La Jangchu Bardu Dagni Kyapsuchi Dagi Jinso Gipe Sonam Ki Rola Penchir Sangye Ruparsho. Then the four immeasurables, and in particular this week and last week, we can think of the humans and animals that are suffering from the wildfires, the fires that have been happening. Hawaii, Canada, it's crazy. It's crazy. So
Everything. Hurricanes.
well, then there are floods and hurricanes. I mean,
Hurricanes.
hello.
Living life in
Welcome to
this
samsara.
realm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So may all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. And then the seventh prayer. Reverently, I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind, and present clouds of every type of offering, actual and mentally transformed. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginningless time, and rejoice in the merits of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain until samsara ends, and turn the wheel of dharma for sentient beings. I dedicate the merit created by myself and others to the great enlightenment. And the mandala offering. Sajipati Jokshim Metu Ramri Radnishi Nidegati Sangye Jidumi Devati Drogunam Dakshina Chakashu Idam Guru Rana Mandala Kam and the essence of causation mantra and the stanza from Nagarjuna's fundamental wisdom of the middle way. Om ye dharma hetu prabhava hetu tesham tatagato yavadat tesham cha yo niroda evam vadi mahashramanava so. And then the stanza. By extinguishing actions and afflictions, there is liberation. Actions and afflictions arise from misconceptions, and misconceptions arise from elaborations. Elaborations will cease through cultivating emptiness. The view that nothing exists inherently. This is actually the whole subject of this chapter, chapter 9, is about, relates to emptiness, and it's all of the previous chapters that Shantideva is leading the practitioner to this particular chapter because it's so important. It's a thing that will actually make the difference between suffering and non-suffering. So emptiness is a view that nothing exists inherently or is self-existently independent. And the way they talk about it is that when you have a realization of emptiness, what you're actually realizing is what they call the object of negation. So when we get right down to it, what we're talking about for ourselves here is the object of negation, the object that we're actually negating when we have a realization of emptiness, is the view that we have an inherently existing self, a me, an I, that we cling on to, grasp onto. And this is throughout the universe, throughout all of samsara, this is the cause of all suffering. It is this grasping at, first of all, me, an inherently existing me and I, and then everything that the me and my sees as belonging to it or that it clings to. And when anything gets in the way of the me and the I getting what it wants and is clinging to, then all of these reflective emotions rise. Then all of the disturbing emotions and the actions that are a result of that. And you can see it can get quite crazy and quite destructive and really horrible. And so this is the key actually to happiness. The key to happiness is to have a realization of this object of negation, to negate this object. So bear that in mind as we're talking about this continuing dialogue between Chittamatra and Prasangika, the highest schools of tennis, the two Mahayana schools. Okay. And what I want to say about Chittamatra, although Shantideva is step by step sort of refuting the things that Chittamatra is saying, there is a lot of what Chittamatra is saying that is correct. And we should not think that we're discarding all of Chittamatra through this discourse that Shantideva is having between the views of Prasangika and Chittamatra. When I was talking to last week, we had Khenpo Sangye Dorje, the monk who was from Nepal, speaking. And then we had a luncheon, and after lunch, I was talking to him, and I was talking to him about Shantideva and about where we were at. We were talking about Prasangika and Chittamatra, and he said, "Oh, Chittamatra, there is a lot in Chittamatra that is correct. So don't discount. Do not discount everything in Chittamatra." So we're going to get to that today. Today is the last day of this Chittamatra Prasangika thing because we have to continue. We have to go on. So in the previous two sessions on this, Shantideva went through various discourses with the Chittamatra view. It's sort of like a debate back and forth, and was one by one kind of disproving or seeing a flaw in what Chittamatra was saying. Ultimately, the mistake that Chittamatra is making is that they're saying that there is something that is inherently self-existent. There is the mind. They're saying the mind basis of all is the inherently existing self that transmigrates from lifetime to lifetime and carries all of the imprints and all this stuff. It's very similar to the view, the Buddha's view of a consciousness that transmigrates from lifetime to lifetime. But the Prasangika view is that consciousness itself is not inherently existing. It is a dependent arising. It is affected and affects all of the things that are around it, and the things that are around that consciousness that affect that consciousness. So it's not, if something truly was independently self-existent, it could not be affected by other things because it would be independently self-existent. We need to understand this. Chittamatra uses the term, when Chittamatra, the proponents of the Chittamatra school, the mind-only school, when they hear the term non-inherent existence, they take that to mean non-existence. They take that to mean illusionary, something that's illusionary, that's an illusionary existence. Now, when we talk about the way the Buddha explained dependent arising, it is, everything is affected by everything else. Now, and you really have to get into this idea of subject and object as well. I'll use this. Now, when we see this, when people see this, they can see, on one level, they can see, oh, this is a dependently arising material object. It was made by somebody. It was made out of wood. They sculpted it. They sanded it. They painted it, right? And then there's also a subject-object relation to this thing. Some people will look at this and be scared. They'll be frightened. They'll look at the dark eyes. They'll look at the skeleton. They'll think, this is very scary. This is about death. I don't want to think about death. So there's a dependently arising connection between the subject viewing this object, that we could see this object as scary. Someone from a different culture or that has a different view will see this as a past relative, that a way to remember them, or somebody, a Buddhist will see this as a symbol of impermanence, which is a reminder that everything is constantly changing, to not get attached and cling on to this particular body, this particular life, this particular state of consciousness, because consciousness itself can change. So you can see there's a dependently arising nature between subject and object, and depending on the subject and depending on the object, it can be seen in many, many different ways. To a dog, this could be a chew toy, and that's how it would be seen.
Right.
It would not be scary. It would be a fun thing to play with. So I just wanted to point that out, that there are so many levels of dependent arising that we don't necessarily think about. And the way that we'll get into this in depth, the way that our human body perceives what we call the world out there it perceives it in such a way that everything seems to be separate. Everything seems to be independent and separated by space. That's the way it looks to us. And so therefore it strengthens that sense that we have of an independent self-existing me, or other, or thing, independently self-existing object. So this is something to bear in mind as we go through this. So where we left off, So Prasangika and Chittamatra, where we left off, they had gone through all kinds of different debates about things, about subject and object, about consciousness being able to. Chittamatra says that since everything exists in the mind, Chittamatra says everything exists in the mind. So what appears externally to us, what is appearing to each one of us externally. Chittamatra would say, this is just all of the mind. It's an appearance of your mind. And the mind itself, and here's where the Chittamatra flaw is. There's not a flaw in the Chittamatra saying everything that appears to us is appearing in our mind. That's not a flaw. The flaw comes when Chittamatra says, and the mind itself is inherently self-existent. The mind itself is inherently self-existence. There's where the problem lies. Because Chittamatra will say, everything out there is unreal. It's an illusion. It's only existing in the mind. But Prasangika comes back and says, well, if you're saying the mind itself is independently self-existence, then what is appearing to the mind must be the mind itself. And therefore you're saying that the appearances of the mind that is inherently self-existent are somehow illusory, and that you can't have what they're called truly existent. Truly existent is the way Chittamatra will say things are truly existent. Something is real when it is truly existent. Truly existent is another term for independently self-existent. So Prasangika is saying you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't say that the mind is truly self-existent and therefore everything is simply an appearance of the mind. But then to say the appearance is an illusion, you're then saying, how can a truly existent mind do that? It can't. You can't have both. You can't have unreal and real in the same mind. So this is where they're going with this. So they get to this point, and the Chittamatrins then put forth the following question, and this is going towards stanza 25. The question is, do you use Prasangikas refute the entire presentation of cognition, including the experiencing, seeing, and hearing of events? So they're saying, okay, Prasangika, are you refuting that we actually, we can hear things, we can see things, we can smell things, we can touch things, and all of these events? Are you saying this actually doesn't exist? The Prasangikas say, it's not indeed, this is stanza 25, it's not indeed our purpose to disprove experiences of sight or sound or knowing, conscious awareness. Our aim here is to undermine the cause of sorrow, the thought that such phenomena have true existence. So this goes back to the idea that the cause of suffering, the cause of all suffering, comes down to this idea of something being able to exist, to self-exist independently. In other words, to be truly existent, to be what they call real. All these terms that they use, which can be very, very confusing. Because when we hear truly existent, we think, this is the thing that's correct. This is the true thing. But this is terminology that we have to redefine for ourselves and understand how it's being used. So truly existent in this case is saying the thing is not independently that truly existent means that something is independently self-existent. And Prasangika is saying that's impossible. That is impossible. That is not the way reality actually works. And when you think, whether we feel that our self, we could say, some people think of their soul, right? And they think that's soul. That's sort of like the mind basis of all. What Chittamatra calls mind basis of all. It's kind of like what other people would think of as their soul. They think it's this inherently self-existent, independent thing that will always be that way. And Prasangika is saying this actually is the cause of suffering. This is what causes our suffering. Because when this independently self-existent thing doesn't meet with what it wants, all of these afflictive emotions arise, and this causes this cycling through samsara and never getting out of it. It's like a trap. It's like an independently self-existent ego trap. Another way of looking at it is that the ego itself is the very basis of samsaric existence. It's the ego. You could also say the ego itself is the object of negation, to having a view of emptiness. And then it starts to get really personal, and we start to see the work we have to do, to sort of cut through my ego. You've got to be kidding. It's what we identify with.
Right.
So this is why this is so difficult for us. It's such a challenge because we're so habituated to this view of the ego, to this self-existing thing that we call me. So the Prasangikas don't refute valid conventional experiences of consciousness, such as sight, hearing, and cognition. They say it's impossible to deny them, and there's no need to do so because the sight, the hearing, and the cognition, those are not the cause of suffering. The cause of suffering is actually this wrong view of inherent self-existence. That's the cause of suffering. And this is where Prasangikas have an issue with Chittamatra, and they're trying to point out that by thinking that the mind itself, the consciousness itself, to think that that is an independently self-existing thing is causing suffering. It's keeping the Chittamatrin actually stuck in a samsaric kind of existence that is only going to lead to isolation and suffering because of that isolation. So then we go into this thing where Chittamatra asks, they're talking about truly existing forms. And the Chittamatrins say, this is stanza 26, illusions are not other than the mind. So this is what the Chittamatrins say. Illusions are not other than the mind, because the Chittamatrins are saying everything is the mind. The mind, basis of all, is all there actually is. And the appearances to that mind are illusions. Illusions are not other than the mind. So Prasangika then says in stanza 26, and yet you don't consider them the same. You're not considering that the illusions that are appearing to you as that external world, you're not considering, Chittamatra, that it's the same as your mind, because you're saying it's an appearance to your mind. There's only your mind that exists, and yet you're saying these things out there that appear to be external are illusory, which is not what you're saying about your mind.
Right.
All right, so we have to think about that and how strange that is. So Prasangika goes on and says, how could they, illusions, not be different if the mind is real? And how can the mind be real if you deny a difference? The Chittamatrins say that since illusory external objects do not exist anywhere other than in the mind, they are not essentially distinguishable from the mind. Nor do they, but they're also saying, nor do they exist in the mind. So they're starting to not make sense here.
Right.
So they say form and so on, form and everything else,
And so on.
do not exist as external objects. But they are not simply non-existent. They are not of a different nature from the mind, nor are they the mind itself. So what are they saying? It's sort of like psychotic. There's like splitting down the middle there. Because if the illusory external objects were identical with the mind, this would undermine the mind's truly inherent existence. And yet they're saying these external objects are nothing but appearances in the mind. And that the mind itself is one and partless. They say, therefore, that the external objects are just like a mirage, hanging in space, groundless, and that the mind is by nature free from all aspects and appearances. The actual natural state of the mind is free from all these appearances. It's like a sphere of pure crystal. This is what the Chittamatrins are saying. It's like a sphere of pure crystal. They say this resolves any possible flaw in their position. The Prasangikas respond by saying that if the Chittamatrins hold the mind to be inherently self-existent and that by nature, the mind is free from all aspects and appearances. How can the appearance to the mind of external objects not be something different from it? The Chittamatrins say that external objects are illusory and unreal, while they believe the mind is inherently existent and real. And between real and unreal, there is no common ground. And if, as they say, the illusory and unreal external objects, if those illusory and unreal external objects are not anything other than the mind, then it follows that the mind is illusory and unreal as well. This is the Prasangika logic being put onto the Chittamatra view. Again, remember, the Chittamatra is very, 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 very close to the Prasangika view. Where they are differing is this idea that the consciousness itself, the mind, the basis of all, is a truly existent, inherently existing thing. So, it said the Chittamatrins are saying if the mind wasn't real, it couldn't function as a perceiver of objects. If the mind wasn't a truly existing inherently thing, it couldn't function as a perceiver of objects, a perceiver of sound, a perceiver of consciousness, all of these kinds of things, thoughts. The Prasangikas reply, and this is stanza 27. Although it is unreal, a mirage can be seen. Now, when you hear this word that's translated as unreal here, and Prasangika is using the word unreal, think dependent arising. Because as I said before, when we're talking about this as being a dependent arising, it's different things to different people. Some think see it positive and wonderful and even funny and joyful, and others find it very frightening and scary, and others don't see either of those things. So the nature of dependent arisings, the nature of the thing itself and the subject that's viewing it is completely changeable, is completely fluid. And in that sense, it's illusion-like. It's like a mirage. It's like as if it were unreal. So this is the nature of dependent arising, and we have to sort of wrap our heads around that because we're not used to habituating ourselves to think that way. So the Prasangikas say, although it is unreal, although it's a dependent arising, a mirage can be seen. We all know a mirage is a dependent arising. We know that the atmosphere and heat and all these kinds of things create this, say in a desert, create this illusion that there's water and there's this mirage out there. And we know that that's not the case. But we also understand that it is a dependent arising, that it's not just merely an illusion. We understand that. So a mirage can be seen, although it is a dependent arising. And Chittamatra says, and that which sees, that which is doing the seeing is just the same. That the consciousness, say the I consciousness that is doing the seeing, is exactly the same as a mirage in that it is a dependent arising. And we're going to go into more detail about this to understand why what we see here, smell, taste, touch, is not actually all that's out there. It is simply a dependent arising, and there's a subject-object relationship between the I consciousness, say, and the subject that is looking at. Chittamatra then says, wait, but samsara, this is still stanza 27, but samsara must be based on something real. If it wasn't based on something real, it would just be like empty space.
The Chittamatrins are saying it?
The Chittamatrins are saying samsara must be based on something real. Samsara must be based on something that is truly existent, truly self-existent, real. Otherwise, samsara would be nothing but just like empty space, like a mirage. Like the mirage that appears to us in a desert
Right.
is like this empty space. Once you go up to it, it's not there.
Right.
The Prasangikas say that in just the same way that an object, though it is a dependent arising and therefore illusion-like, that can be perceived by the mind. Likewise, the mind, though it is a dependent arising, the mind itself is a dependent arising and therefore is illusion-like. But that mind can act as the perceiver of objects. This is actually what's going on. We try to concretize everything and make everything seem like it's existing inherently rather than it's dependently arising. The Chittamatrins object to this reasoning, and they say that samsara has to be supported by a really, truly existing mind. Otherwise, if the mind were not truly inherently existent, then samsara would simply be nothing, like empty space. It would be impossible for the appearances of samsara to arise, for they would be without anything to support them. But the Prasangikas ask, if samsara is real, is it identical with the mind or is it different from the mind? If samsara is identical to the mind, it would be impossible to escape from samsara. If cyclic existence were identical with the mind, if it came out of a truly, really existing mind that was supporting it, and therefore it was the cyclic existence was therefore an aspect of that truly existing mind, then it would be impossible to escape from it. On the other hand, Prasangika says, if samsara is different from the mind, it would be inconsistent with the Chittamatra position that asserts everything exists in the mind. So again, it's pointing out the flaw of the Chittamatra view that the mind itself is inherently existing. And stanza 28, Prasangika says, but how could an illusion be causally effective? How can an illusion cause something, be the cause of something? How could an illusion be part of the process of cause and effect? I'll read it again. How could the unreal be causally effective, even if it rests on something real? Then Prasangika says to Chittamatra, this mind of yours is isolated and alone in solitude and unaccompanied. The Prasangika's reason that if samsara is like this, if it is unreal, if it's an illusion, then samsara cannot be causally effective. There cannot be a process of cause and effect that occurs, because if you think of any kind of thing that's truly an illusion, it can't actually, what would be a good example? Maybe something like a hologram. A hologram actually cannot cause something else to exist. The hologram can merely display itself the way it's been programmed to display, but it cannot go beyond that and actually be part of the cause and effect chain. In other words, that it can be causally, that it can affect a cause. So what they're saying is an illusion can't actually affect a cause. Therefore, even if samsara had as its basis a real, inherently existing mind, as the Chittamatrins assert, how could one be either trapped in it or liberated from it? An unreal thing cannot be supported by anything. If it could, it would become a functioning thing and be a part of the sequence of cause and effect. I guess maybe my hologram example is not actually a really good thing, because the hologram is a result of a cause. And the effect is the hologram. So, maybe we can scratch that. We're talking about something that's truly just an illusion. That's a figment. That's a total mirage. And Prasangika is saying that doesn't exist, it can't exist. And if samsara were like that, there couldn't be this cause and effect cycle going on.
Yeah, I mean, you will not be successful in finding any causeless example.
That's right. I think so. So the causeless example is simply a concept.
Mhm.
It's simply a concept. Because when you get down to it, reality, the nature of reality is that everything is part of this whole dependently arising soup. And therefore, samsara is a dependently arising thing. The mind is a dependently arising thing. The reason this is good, it means that the mind can change. The mind can figure out what is the cause of this samsara cyclic existence, which causes so much suffering to the mind. When the mind realizes that the cause of this samsaric suffering existence is the view that the self exists inherently and independently, that there's an ego there that's somehow really me, when the mind becomes more habituated to that idea and begins to let go of it, and ultimately then lets go of it, samsara, the causes for samsara then cease to exist, and samsara will no longer be a functioning thing for that mind.
So did the Chittamatrins agree with the Prasangikas that dependent arising is reality?
They don't have the view. The Chittamatra view is that everything is the mind only, and the mind itself is an independently self-existing thing. It's a truly existing real
I
thing.
get that.
So within that system, they're not saying that the external objects that appear to be external out there, they're not saying that they're dependent arisings. They're saying that they're not of the mind, and yet they're somehow part of the mind, but they're not the mind. They're not actually coming out and saying that they are dependent arisings, because somehow that would make the mind itself not this self-contained, really existing thing. Because if you are a self-contained, really existing thing, then there is no way that dependent arising can function with you.
Well, I'm not sure
Well, think about it. Think about it. If you were a complete unto yourself system that was truly inherently existing and did not depend on anything else, that would mean no other appearances that were dependent arisings could affect you at all, or perhaps even appear to you. I don't know, but this is all actually in the realm of concept, because that's not the way things really are. And I think this is why it gets so confusing for us. I think it's why the Chittamatrins were confused about this view.
Okay, the other thing is sort of related to Brian's question.
It's because it's like you become an isolation chamber.
You're answering this question from the viewpoint of Prasangika, and so, in a way, you have to explore the question.
Well, all right, let me read
from
you.
within the mind of a Chittamatra.
All right, here's what the Chittamatrins say. Since illusory external objects do not exist anywhere other than in the mind, they are not essentially distinguishable from the mind, nor do they exist as the mind. This is where it kind of falls apart.
Boss, what was your question, Brian? I got a little lost with yours.
So I was just asking, in the Chittamatrin view, which says the mind is actually a independent entity, whether they believe that dependent arising can exist in the presence of an independent existing mind. In other words, they see everything as an illusion, basically, as I understand what you said. But they say the mind is not an illusion, the mind is an independent existing thing. So, in some sense, the question in my mind is, okay, if my mind is independently existing, but I still say everything else is dependently existing. And if I understand that everything is dependently existing, and therefore is a function of cause and effect, and therefore I can still say, or I can still intellectually intellectually think that if I still realize that everything that my mind is interpreting is not conventional reality, but it is ultimate reality, and that if I understand whatever action I take has a cause and effect and everything is dependent, I still want to take the right action in order to create the right path forward for myself and for all other sentient beings. So I guess fundamentally, and I think this is what Chris was trying to get at, fundamentally is whether your mind is independently existing or not, or whether it itself is a dependent phenomenon, how does that matter with respect to, say, the Chittamatrins' illusions that everything exists as an illusion versus dependent arising, which is like an illusion,
But not an illusion,
but not an illusion.
because it can be experienced.
I mean,
Yeah,
again, you have to, within the Chittamatra system. You have to answer your question from within Chittamatra, in my
Right.
opinion,
no, you do.
and. It is a little bit, it's not a direct, there's not a direct answer in the way you ask the question, because within the Chittamatra system. They don't talk about it that way at all. They have this thing about objects. They have this thing called the three natures, and that's how they address how things exist. So you have to, I mean, I was just looking up.
Oh,
page
it's
number
complicated.
260, if you have this book, and I think you do, is where it explains how Chittamatra sees objects through the lens of what they call the three natures. And, you know, I'm not gonna go into it, but
Well, again, I don't want to be argumentative, but I would say, just say parenthetically, the Chittamatrins may have their view, and the Prasangikas may have their view. Each one of those may be right or wrong, but there may be yet another view
yeah,
that
yeah.
can somehow rationalize the coexistence of these different things.
Well, it's something,
I think you're right.
if something was independently self-existent.
Look, Christopher, don't forget all the sub-schools at Chittamatra.
I'm
I'm sure.
Oh,
some
God,
groups,
there's-
things exactly what you're saying.
there are sub
I
schools,
mean, there's a problem too with this, the way they say there's 4 tenets, but when you read this Chittamatra section, you'll go. There's a jillion different ways of thinking under that umbrella called Chittamatra. I mean, it's not very.
yeah, but
It's
for
almost
our
like-
purposes, we're trying to get it to a,
The thing that all
overall-
Chittamatra do agree on is that, you know, everything exists externally.
all right, so no, everything that exists
I mean-
externally is in the mind.
Yeah.
So it's something, they're saying that the mind is independently self-existent, in other words. So anything that is independently self-existent cannot be affected by, they're not susceptible to dependent arising, that something else affecting it and changing it, because it is an independent self-existing entity. There's not, by definition, it cannot be affected by something else. It cannot change because it is an independently self-existing phenomenon. And this is what Chittamatra is saying the mind is. So it actually cannot be part of this dependently arising situation. The closest they get is that they just say that the external appearance is part of the mind itself and doesn't actually exist the way it appears to exist, and that it is an illusion. Not illusion like, it is an illusion.
Okay.
It is unreal. And that's their view. That's where they sort of get themselves boxed into this view that doesn't work, you know, which is, and the whole point of Prasangika pointing this out is not to just say, you know, Chittamatrins, you're wrong. That's not the point. The point is to get at what is actually causing suffering, and the cause of suffering is this independently self-existent view of things. that's what causes suffering.
Right, and I guess definitionally from what you just say, it doesn't work, but on the other hand, and maybe, again, maybe the subtlety here is escaping me, but just like emptiness is escaping me. So I could still say with, that, I mean, I guess because I learned my mind changes and my mind grows, it's not a static, non-changing, independent entity. I mean, I get that definition.
You have the experience of it.
Right. So, but I could still say, I could still think to myself that I could have an independent mind. I could still understand dependent arising, causes and conditions, practice the way I think and live, aligned with the Prasangika philosophy, but still think that my mind is really controlling what I do.
So, in other words, you could have a view that within the mind, your own mind, this whole dependently arising system, you could say you can see it happen, which is similar to what the Chittamatrins are saying. They're saying all these external appearances, which seem to change and move and all this kind of stuff, you could say those are sort of dependently arising, changing things. However, the Chittamatrins are saying it's all occurring in the mind, which is this kind of like isolation chamber. The mind itself is not affected by other things outside of it, because it's mind only. The mind itself exists independently, self-existent. It is not affected by anything else out there. So within that mind itself that's not affected by anything out there, it can have the mirage of dependently arising things, but Chittamatra is saying that's just a mirage.
So maybe I'm taking too much time, so maybe I
No.
Let's go to subtle consciousness. And again, you have explained and taught that subtle consciousness, which we believe goes from lifetime to lifetime to lifetime, somehow is also dependent arising, but also has the ability to retain some permanence of our previous karma, our previous life experiences that somehow move into the next life.
What I would say is that karma is never permanent. So you can't say the permanence of some kind of karma. Karma is a thing that's constantly changing, and you can change karma.
Again, but if I understand, maybe I know, the principle, the definition of karma from this subtle consciousness standpoint is that your karmic actions over your many lifetimes comes with your subtle consciousness in your current lifetime.
Right. So they're very strong habitual patterns of the mind.
Right, and those can change, I understand, depending on your practice, but nonetheless, there is something that exists that, and maybe this is a time scale thing, but exists independently from lifetime to lifetime.
No, that's not the way they would put it. So because what you have, this consciousness itself is moment to moment to moment to moment. Remember, everything is moment to moment to moment. Everything is impermanent. It's not like the consciousness is this permanent stream. A stream is an actually really good analogy. When you think of a stream, a brook, it's constantly moving. It's constantly changing. You cannot pin it down. And this is the way the consciousness itself is. Now, a stream can create sort of passageways through its the power of that stream that you could call habitual propensities. That the stream is going to go in a certain way, or it's going to bottleneck in a certain way, and then it's going to push out with a lot of pressure. That just has to do with the way that stream is flowing. Similar with our mind, the way our mind is going with our habitual our habits, I would say, our habits of body, speech, and mind, that we carry those with us the way a stream carries those the way the stream would carry the water with it. And the stronger the habit that we have, the stronger that propensity imprints on every moment of our consciousness as it moves, as it changes. So until we understand that what's causing the suffering, until we understand why we have what we would say is negative, what we'd say negative karma, actions that we engaged in that caused a reaction that is painful to us, until we understand how we did that, why we did that, and the mistake that was made, that karma is actually not going, it's just going to play out. And we're going to experience the suffering that will result from, I'd say, negative karma. There's also positive karma too. There are positive actions, and we will experience the positive results of that. But our job is actually to understand the nature of how this works,
So
and that it can change.
when you're saying, or when Lama Prasang says you have these karmic predispositions, or Venerable Ravina says you have these karmic predispositions that move from lifetime to lifetime, you're calling those
Imprints.
Their imprints.
They're imprints on the consciousness that the consciousness carries.
I'd like
Most
to
moment.
propose a different way of naming those, because it's sort of more like a vibrational clump of with momentum, a momentum of vibrational predispositions that are required in order to sustain themselves. This is important because in order to continue to exist, we understand that vibrations have to keep changing and vibrating. So it's not like an imprint in the sense of like a wax seal on your consciousness.
Right.
It's like an accrued, an acquired, it's like an acquired taste, the vibration of that tendency, we call it an imprint, but it's not such a solid thing.
Yeah, we call it an imprint, but another word that we could use is habit. And we all know how habits are. We don't know when we have strong habits.
I don't mean to interrupt. I just want to clarify because you guys are getting a little technical,
Uh-huh.
really quick, because I got a little confused on that. Same thing, quoting Lama Prasang or even Venerable Ravina. I was under the impression that you do bring some karma from your previous lives. And by using the word karma, I'm using this concept we're talking about, like those tendencies, that's the word I'm gonna use it, tendencies that we bring from all our previous lives.
Mhm.
Is that what you're referring to, the vibrational, so those tendencies that we have, like, I'm just.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just pointing out, they're not a solid thing. They're
Right.
a
Consciousness
vibrational,
itself.
alive, active thing.
Consciousness itself is like an energy of some sort. I mean,
The
it's.
past action.
Yeah. Now, this is a very true statement. Ravina has said this, and she is on the mark. We are nothing but a bunch of habits. That is all we are. And therefore, if we have habits that are causing us and others pain, we need to change those habits. And we all know the stronger the habit that we have, the more difficult it is to change that habit. We have to assert a lot of effort into changing that habit. And we have to understand that the habit is causing suffering, which is why we want to change that habit.
And it's always changing, I mean.
Well, and
Yeah.
that's the thing, it's always changing. Yes, there are some habits that come, from our past lives that we don't even remember.
But
if
we carry them.
But we do carry them.
Moment to moment.
But I just want to
Exactly.
say,
And
where
if-
do we carry them? You gotta stop. You keep asking like there's some me that's carrying something.
The
You
consciousness.
have to think of it like
I guess we just like this,
a woven.
Chittamatrins like you.
You have to think of it like a active, constantly, perpetually in motion jumble of electronic energy that's barreling forward with patterns that we call habits. And patterns that maybe seem to have been triggered by a past action, but it's not like it's stamped.
No,
Well, we're right, and that's what I was trying to say. That energy has come, and flows through our consciousness in this lifetime. we now.
That is the flow of our consciousness. There's no consciousness flow through.
Through the Buddhism practice that we're learning, we can say now, oh, you mean I can shift today, now, my negative karma from that's come through to this life. I can do things today to change it.
Let me-
If it was stamped and solid,
You
you
could
couldn't
change,
change
right.
it. Your
Okay,
negative
I'm
karma
gonna
whatever would
even
be your
enhance
negative
what you
karma.
said. You're not
know?
even, there's no I that's
Well,
changing or
right.
shifting. That is what we are, a shift. We are
All right.
a perpetual sand dune.
Go back to this concept of a stream, because very often they call it the mind stream.
Yes.
We know,
Yeah,
if we look at a stream, you cannot pin it down.
right,
You cannot like put it in a box and go, this is the stream. The stream is constantly changing, constantly moving, and the stream is carrying things with it.
right, yeah, sticks, leaves,
The
whatever.
things that, it will carry things with it. So when we say our consciousness carries things, that's just a way of saying that moment to moment, a habit is so strong that the imprint of a habit is so strong that it jumps to the next moment, to the next moment, to the next moment, to the next moment.
Right,
There is an I, but the I that exists is merely like the name stream.
right,
It's a label. Stream is nothing that is solid that you could pick up. You can sort of define what it is, but you cannot put stream in an actual stream in a box and say, here it is.
right,
I give you the stream. A stream is constantly changing and moving
right,
and shifting. And that's what the I is. The I is basically the label. The label for this is a mere label. It's nothing but a label for this constantly moving, shifting bunch of habits, bunch of propensities,
right,
which creates a direction. Now, the direction can be positive, the direction can be negative, the direction can go sort of back and forth and get stuck over here and, swirl around for a while and then
Right.
move on. What our job is to understand this, to understand that the I is a changeable thing,
right.
that the karma is a changeable
And
thing.
that's
The
point I was
actions,
trying to make,
this
is
can
changing it.
change, our habits can change, but we also know, you think of any really strong habit that you have that you don't like, that you wish you didn't have it, but it's so strong, that habit is so strong, it's like moth to a flame. You cannot, it's so difficult for you to break that habit. You think of what you would have to do to break those habits is you have to basically stop the habit and do something that replaces it, and keep doing that thing that replaces it, that until that replacement itself becomes the habit, and the bad habit just sort of dissolves.
Right,
Now, maybe I've had experiences of myself of things like that with bad habits that just dissolve, they were gone. Some are very difficult, some are easier, I don't know why. Maybe it's just the force of them. But this is this is our job.
yeah,
When we're dealing with karma and purifying our karma, they say purify your negative karma or change your karma to something that is going to be beneficial for yourself as well as everything you're interconnected with. I think that, the stream is a good example,
yeah.
this
It's always
idea,
flowing.
yeah, consciousness is like a stream, this is the way they talk about it. Okay,
Yeah.
Should we go on?
Yeah.
Okay. I know we probably didn't answer that to your satisfaction,
It's
but
okay.
okay.
This is why.
It's something to
discussion
think
and
about.
yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask you one more thing?
Yeah.
I just wanna, and sorry if I'm not up to y'all's speed, but to Brian's point, I had the same exact question. So the Chittamatrins, they see this concept of the mind, which is already clear to all of us, and mind only kind of like an isolation chamber. And then the Prasangikas, they have they're not trying to define the concept, they see some similarities, but they have a different approach. But isn't it don't we have a third approach where we can combine the concept? Because I try to relate it in my mind to like what we're saying, the word ego and just basic psychology type of stuff.
Mhm.
Well, your mind, the Chittamatrins, they do have a point in terms of our perception is a reality type of thing. So is there a third way to see things between those two?
You mean, is there a way to see like an ego?
No, is there a way to see those two lineages or those two perspectives combined?
Oh, absolutely.
Because give me a minute, what she said, you can only answer your question if you see things the way that the Chittamatrins see.
This is why I said at the beginning, much of what Chittamatra says is correct. It is in alignment with what Prasangika would say. The main difference, the difference we're talking about here is that the Chittamatrins are saying their mind exists inherently. That their consciousness, their stream, is an inherent thing in a box. It's not affected by other things. It is a self-existing, independent mind that they call the basis of all. And this is the main flaw. In terms of things appearing in a particular way to the mind, we'll go into that. That is absolutely things appearing externally to us in a way that are like illusions. Absolutely, Prasangika would not disagree with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I just would like to throw out there that this discussion is scratching the surface, and to authentically really understand what each of these schools are saying, you really have to do some independent reading and studying and thinking, because we're not really uncovering the fullness of the differences, because we can't.
We can't. We have to boil it down, bring it down to the main points.
In some ways, it's like beings from different planets. And it's really important. If you really want to understand it, you really have to.
Well, in as much as you could say, if we look back at human evolution, we could say some of those, the precursors of humans were like beings from another planet. I mean, they just bear no resemblance to, what we think of ourselves as humans. Well,
Right.
This is an evolution of thought, the four schools. It's not that there are things that are correct about each of these schools that can be taken, and that are important to study these schools for those reasons. It's also really important to see where they're making the mistake.
Right.
Like I've said before, Prasangika has not yet been able to be refuted by anybody.
Can I just, in a way, it'd be like. The Truman Show, a lot of what that guy experienced, you could say was real, but the whole context of his experience was a falsity.
Right.
And that's one way one has to accept the differences between the schools.
In other words,
It's not that.
yeah, just like in the Truman Show, that basically that huge chamber that was built for him to be, virtual world.
Right.
He was actually experiencing it. The real world was going on. He was being observed, and all these kinds of things put on TV, put on billboards,
Right.
blah blah blah. It was really the real world was going on, and yet in the Truman Show, that he
All
was
saw was-
in a fake world. Well, the Chittamatra view, the real world is going on with all of these schools, Vaibhashika, Sautrantika, Chittamatra, and Prasangika. Reality is reality. Reality is occurring. But each one of these schools are in their own little kind of box that is not taking in all of reality.
Right.
Chittamatra is coming the closest to the ultimate view, but is not letting go of the idea that there is this inherently existing consciousness,
Right.
like this stream that you can put in a box and say this is it, and nothing else is going to affect it, because it is independently self-existent.
Right.
That is the mistake Chittamatra is making, and yet reality is going on, happening. It's not like Chittamatrins are lost in some other reality. They are in reality. Yeah.
But the other thing to look at is what is the fruit of the path that they're suggesting.
Mhm.
So
Right.
it would be like saying, well, we all are familiar, there are a lot of things there's a lot of stuff that's correct. We can talk about fake news and conspiracy theories as a good example. And 99, good fake news, 90% of it is true. But if you don't understand the overall context of what's trying to be elicited by the quote conspiracy theory, fake news, then you miss the point that it's not reliable. So I mean, it's that's why I just would emphasize again to really get the differences, and you have to get within the mindset of that particular school, which is not easy to do.
No, but I mean,
Anyway.
in a short period of time, I think Shanti Dev is doing a good job of,
Yeah.
of going through it. All right. Okay. If this is Prasangika, sort of talking about Chittamatra. If according to the Chittamatran way of thinking, the mind was something truly and inherently self-existent, then it could not possibly be related to or dependent upon any objects. If it was truly inherently self-existent, it could not possibly be related or dependent upon any other objects. Now we're talking truly inherently self-existent.
Like it's there, period, solid.
It doesn't need anything else. There is nothing else for it to need.
And that's why, that's the flaw.
We have this inherent feeling that that's the way we are. And yet reality shows us that's not the case.
Right.
Right, I'm not gonna ask it because it will just send us down.
Okay.
Ask after class.
All right. If that were, if it could be a truly, yes.
Kevin.
Kevin's got a question.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, Christopher, so at the risk of beating this discussion to death, I just have a question. When we talk about, Ravina likes to use the acorn example, right? That an acorn could grow to an oak tree, but it doesn't inherently grow to an oak tree, causes and conditions. So there is an objective in mind. When I think about that in conjunction with the stream as a metaphor for consciousness, a stream doesn't have an objective. A stream just flows. It doesn't aspire to be a river. It doesn't aspire to be an ocean, etc. But an acorn could aspire to be an oak tree, right? Because that's what it has in nature, that it could grow to an oak tree. So when we talk, I'm just trying to, maybe I misunderstood how those two might be connected.
Well, I mean, a stream in its nature, say it's a mountain stream, right? It starts flowing from, the snow is melting, it flows down, down, down. Then it will flow, all these streams will then go into like a river. I mean, it's similar to the acorn possibly becoming an oak tree. Possibly these streams will then flow into a river, and that possibly that river will then flow into the ocean.
Right.
But it's not set in stone that that's going to happen.
Causes and conditions.
It's causes and conditions, just like the acorn. It's not different than the acorn. The example of the stream is the same as the acorn. The stream has the potential to go all the way to the ocean, but not necessarily. But it depends on causes and conditions. And if the causes and conditions aren't there for that stream to go into the ocean, it won't. And if the causes and conditions for a sentient being are not there to remove the blocks that we have to complete happiness and enlightenment, then it won't happen. But if we create the causes and conditions for that to happen and stick with it, slowly, generate new habits that are in alignment with that goal, that outcome of becoming enlightened, then the consciousness can do that. But as we see from examples of samsaric existence, what really seems to happen, and without any guidance, unless we have guidance, what we do is we just keep going around and around, and we make the same mistakes over and over and over again. And these mistakes then become our strong habits that are very, very difficult for us to shake, which is why it's so important to have a teacher, the teachers, these qualified teachers that can help us that can guide us, guide our stream into the larger magnificent ocean, if you want to put it in those terms, or guide the acorn, with the right causes and conditions to be this magnificent oak tree that is of benefit to so many beings. It's like that. I mean, I don't actually, personally, I don't see a difference between the acorn and the stream analogy, other than one's water and one's, having to do with the vegetation.
So an acorn can't be an elm tree, or can't be a pine tree, or.
Oh, exactly. Yeah,
Exactly, it
Yeah.
can't be.
right,
So there's some constraint on,
right. However, in our consciousness has within its potential, because of what consciousness is, to become fully enlightened. That's like the acorn has within its potential to become an oak tree, not an elm tree, not a fig tree, an oak tree. So we have the potential to become enlightened,
Not an elm tree, not an oak tree.
Yeah.
Enlightened.
not something else. I mean, this is what the Buddha
I
said.
guess I'm going back to Kevin's question, I guess. Okay, so. Again, not thinking through this, but one could think. This one could think that the acorn has some constraints on it that allows it only to become an acorn tree. When you become enlightened, you become all-knowing, all
Right.
Well,
omniscient.
Of
Yeah.
course, these are analogies.
So,
But the tree, I mean, but you could say a magnificent oak tree with beautifully, it is the home to many animals. It is benefit in terms of the shade. It
Of course,
benefits the
sure.
whole ecosystem.
Sure.
So, I mean, there's
It equates to
the
that.
analogy is there.
Right, I guess I'm thinking a little differently, I'm thinking about, we just talked about everything is dependent arising.
Mhm.
So you have an acorn tree, and the acorn tree produces a nut. The nut then has the right causes and conditions, water, soil, etc., turns into another acorn tree.
Oh, yeah,
Oak tree,
Mhm.
whatever they. Okay.
acorns, oaks.
Okay, so it turns into another oak tree.
Uh-huh.
Okay, but there's no set of causes and conditions that will turn it into a pine tree.
Correct.
Correct.
Okay.
Unless, somebody was to fiddle with the,
Okay, yeah, I mean,
Mhm.
if you artificially,
Mhm.
okay,
Engineer,
Yeah.
engineer you can do, but. Does that mean that acorn then has some fixed. Independent qualities that say I only can be an oak tree
no,
and not a pine tree?
no, the acorn can be food. It's food for the deer. They eat them all the time. The squirrels, they eat them. Acorn can be food. I mean, when I was little, I used to carve out the inside of an acorn, stick a hole in it, and put a stick in there and make a little pipe. It could be a toy. It's not, it can be many, many things.
But it can also not be everything. Independent arising.
Correct,
or
because it
causes
depends
and
on the
conditions.
subject
Yeah.
observing it.
Basically, everything is this soup of dependent arising and impermanence. So everything is part of a whole dependently arising system.
I think.
And you
that's
can
the
see
point.
that-
You're saying there's limitations as to what that acorn can become. So it's dependent on those, and on that set of conditions that can make them another oak.
Well, how does an acorn eventually get to be a human?
Exactly. So it's limited to set.
An acorn is not a sentient being. So an acorn does not have in its potential it has no potential within it to be a sentient being. It doesn't have the consciousness that we're talking about, the kind of consciousness we're talking about.
Okay.
I mean, I would say, it's just empirical evidence would tell you that.
So again. Dependent arising and causes conditions so that, as I understand it, that you have to have all these right causes and conditions to come together to get something to happen.
Yes,
Correct.
yes.
But are you then saying there are limits on the causes and conditions capabilities to create any possibility?
Limits like what would be the limitation of, say, a Buddha?
I have no idea.
Right,
You tell me, I mean, you.
We're not Buddhists, so
everybody
we-
tells me
yeah.
there are no rules for somebody to be the true Buddha,
right.
right? But in some sense, a Buddha could come back as an oak tree if it wanted to.
That's correct, but it would not be your average oak tree. It would be for a reason. Yeah,
Sure.
yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
I guess, I guess I'm.
Yeah, someone to.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to say, is there, I mean, we speak as if there's no constraint on, dependent arising on causes and conditions. And we believe everything is due to dependent arising, and everything is due to causes and conditions coming together with the dependent arising, create an
Right.
outcome, whatever that outcome is.
Right.
I'm just trying to push.
Right, I mean, I think what you're saying is, yes, trees, vegetation, they fit into the model of dependent arising, but they can't go beyond being what they are in terms of the cycle. We see this cycle that happens with nature and trees and how it functions. It's part of the whole ecosystem. It has to do with the atmosphere and the rain and all of these kinds of things.
So
The oxygen, it's so connected.
I get it. I understand completely what you're saying.
Mhm.
I get it. So then for sentient beings, you can only go back so far. So a sentient being in one life could never become an oak tree in a different life.
Not a sentient being, no.
No.
So they wouldn't actually be the oak tree. What they could do, and this happens in, we're really getting off track here though. Some disembodied entities, consciousnesses that are kind of lost. You could call them ghosts, maybe. Some people refer to them as ghosts, but the ghosts will take on like the appearance of a body or something. Remember, Susie saw one right in her bedroom.
Mhm.
But they walked through the door and I'm standing there. But Tomei talked about a tree in their village up in the mountains, and then we're talking about a village where people's minds are totally open to a different way of a view of reality that we just do not have. So in this village there was a tree, and the tree had been embodied by some kind of conscious entity that was disembodied. And it was sort of stuck. It was like really attached to that tree. And so people were quite aware that this tree had a like a being in it. Now it's possible for consciousness, and I've read this, and when they talk about the various realms that consciousness can go into, a consciousness can be so absorbed with a particular object that they could, their consciousness could say, I'm just going to, stay with this. I'm going to embody this door, I'm going to embody this tree. It can only last for so long. But consciousness has the capability, because consciousness is immaterial. It can, if it gets fixated on something, and it's not embodied, it could, say, I'm gonna be in these glasses, I'm gonna be in this piece of jewelry that I used to own. Something like that. Lama Zopa Rinpoche was talking about somebody had a cup and they had died. This was in a little village in, I don't know if it was Nepal or wherever it was. And they had a little cup, and this person, when they died, their consciousness did not want to, this was their favorite cup. They were so attached to their home, their place, that the consciousness kind of went into this cup. And the people who lived in that household brought the cup to Lama Zopa because they said, this cup is possessed. There's something wrong with this cup. It's causing all these issues in our house. And Lama Zopa just did these things and talked to the being, the consciousness that was not letting go. And the consciousness then was able to let go. So consciousness is a very fluid kind of thing. And the material world that appears to us is also a very fluid kind of thing that we don't realize that it is because of how it appears to us, which we should really get into this, because this really goes to the Chittamatra view and the Prasangika view. Anyway, Prasangika says that in the Chittamatra way of thinking, the mind is something truly and inherently existent, self-existent. Then it could not possibly be related to or dependent upon any objects. It would be an isolated, independent, self-knowing, self-illuminating mind that was a solitary cognition of itself. And then here's stanza 29. If the mind indeed is free of objects, this is Chittamatra talking. This is Chittamatra responding to Prasangika. If the mind indeed is free of objects, all beings must be Buddhas, thus gone and enlightened. And so what purpose can there be in saying this, that there's only mind? This is Prasangika talking about the Chittamatra view of the mind. I'll read it again. This is Prasangika talking to Chittamatra. If the mind indeed is free of objects, all beings must be Buddhas, thus gone and enlightened. And so what purpose can there be in saying thus that there is only mind? So here's an explanation of this. If the mind is indeed inherently, independently self-existent, and therefore without a perceived object, that the objects are the mind itself, is what Chittamatra is saying. The external objects out there are the mind. If the mind is indeed inherently, independently self-existent, and therefore without a perceived object, that also means it is empty of being a perceiving subject, because there is no object. It is the mind itself. So there's not a subject-object situation going on. According to the Chittamatrins, when the, quote, emptiness of subject and object is actualized, ultimate reality manifests. So according to their argument, it would then follow that all beings with such a mind, an independently self-existing mind, would have already manifested ultimate reality, because there would be no subject-object in actuality. And they would have been fully enlightened Buddhas from the very beginning, without needing to make an effort on the path. In which case, what's the point of elaborating a philosophical system that says everything is mind? What benefit would there be in trying to prove that all phenomena are of the nature of the mind only? If it was the mind only, in other words, and there was no subject-object, if that has been just dissolved, then you're already talking about having some kind of enlightened mind.
Right.
According to the Chittamatra's view. Now, according to the Prasangika view, a Buddha's mind is impermanent. A Buddha's mind is constantly changing. Constantly changing. That's what enables a Buddha to help beings in this multitude, infinite number of ways, because the mind is constantly changing and shifting.
Except Buddha would never become unenlightened.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Once you have had that realization and gone all the way, that's not going to be undone, because your mind now understands. Your mind now knows. The mind stream is not going to go back to this mistaken view that when it sees the actual error that it has made.
So by
corrected
definition,
it.
is that not something that is?
No, it's still interconnected and interdependent. It's still part of dependent arising. Otherwise, the Buddha couldn't actually be of help. Our teachers couldn't help us. The Buddha couldn't help us.
Please don't misunderstand. I'm just trying to look for things that, to me, kind of, at least definitionally, kind of don't completely align with how we define some of these processes. Because if it's, I mean, I get it, yeah. Buddha's enlightened, he, she, whatever, says I'm completely enlightened, I completely understand, therefore I'm never going to go back. But definitionally, because I'm never going to go back and I'm never going to necessarily change, therefore that is a existence that is interdependent once I become an enlightened Buddha.
Right, a Buddha is never going to return to a mistaken view of existence.
Right.
Basically a false, mistaken view of existence, which pushes and fights with the reality and causes all kinds of suffering.
I understand. I mean, I understand.
But the Buddha is still within the whole system of reality, which is dependent arising.
Right. I guess in my mind, if you have something that's not changing, that is part of the definition of independent existence.
Yes,
Enlightenment is not changing once you reach it.
no, enlightenment continues to, it's moment to moment, there's impermanence to it. When we're talking about a change, we're talking about impermanence, just like a moment to moment. If the Buddha was permanent, the Buddha would be frozen, couldn't help, couldn't do anything. You know, and if an enlightened being was permanent, what, according to the definitions of permanence, it doesn't mean that it's different than saying an enlightened being is never going to go back to being a sentient, confused being. And so therefore you think, oh, well, that's a permanent change. You could maybe look at it in those terms, but that's not how they're using permanent and impermanent here. Permanent means that it cannot shift from moment to moment to moment to moment to moment. It's just stuck. Impermanent means it's shifting, it's changing, momentarily it's changing. And a Buddha is impermanent, not permanent. A Buddha is not stuck, you know, not stuck in an ice cube of enlightenment.
In some ways, it seems at times they're having, well, let's say this, they have it both ways, basically. That's kind of what I think sometimes is they have some of it both ways. And whatever makes sense to them makes sense to them, and that, you know, they explain it and they negate all this and they argue all, but in fact, you know, it just seems to me in some ways, sometimes you can still have impermanence in a Buddha and continue to change, but at the same time, you're never going to go away from being enlightened, and that is a then non-changing condition, which is the definition of.
Well, that depends on your definition of enlightenment
Exactly,
itself.
yes.
If you think enlightenment itself is a non-changing condition, then we're mistaken. Because enlightenment itself is able to change. An enlightened being, for instance, could show up like some of our teachers do. They can play the devil's advocate. They can play, they can elicit something that they know will help you, but maybe very upsetting to you, but they know this is the thing that's going to shake this person to their core and make their mind change. Well, a Buddha could appear in that way.
So it's like in an elevator.
Mhm.
Okay, I'm in an elevator. The ground floor is enlightenment.
Okay.
All the other floors above are changing enlightenment, whatever. So I can go all the way up I want to go and keep becoming more enlightened, change my enlightenment, whatever. Like never go back below the ground floor because that's
You'll never go back to being deluded.
right. I agree.
Yes,
I
correct.
understand. I
In your
understand.
analogy, yes,
Yeah.
you will never go below the ground floor,
Right.
ever again.
Right. Yes.
Which means
Permanent.
permanent.
Yes,
Okay.
you could put it in those terms. Yeah.
And I'm not trying to, I mean, I know that, I understand that even enlightened being is continually evolving, changing, impermanent, I get it.
As it's
I
right.
get it.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, you know, I'm looking for examples where the arguments that Prasangika uses, or even Buddhism uses to kind of say nothing is permanent, you know.
Right. I mean, it's definition of terms and
I
clarification
get-
of
yes,
terms,
and that
right?
may be-
But what you're talking about is ground floor, and you cannot.
Yes,
You can't.
Yes, once a Buddha, you're not going to go back to being a deluded sentient being.
But even as a Buddha, as Christopher said, you're enlightened now.
I get it.
So it also is
That's why I
not,
say you got it both ways, you know, you can change and evolve, but you know, there's something that's not. gonna-
Right.
Aspect of permanent is there.
Right,
Basically, it's sort of aligning yourself with the reality. And once you align yourself with the reality, well, why wouldn't you want that change to
I
be
get that. I get
permanent?
that. Don't
Yeah.
disagree at all.
Yeah.
I don't disagree at all.
Yeah, but the terminology and definition of terms and clarification of terms are extremely important in any scientific endeavor or debate. Because if we're not clear on our terms, then we're not clear on how we understand those terms and how we communicate with one another.
And I'm sorry, this is turning into a lot of questions, but I'm in the same seat when it comes to, I want to fully understand this. I know Kavita mentioned, of course, we have to do independent reading, but this is just whether it's the Prasangikas or anybody, this is just contributions to the Buddhism that we see today, am I right?
Mhm.
So the way I see it is, of course, we're getting technical and seeing all the aspects of the school and how they saw things. But in reality, they were just making contributions to what we see today and what the teachers are teaching
Mhm.
us.
Mhm.
So it's a holistic concept of.
Yeah, it's similar to the contributions that science has made throughout the century.
Exactly, like
You know,
if
you go from Isaac Newton, to Einstein. to-
Pavlov's or
Right.
whatever you wanna call it, or Milgram.
It's just a evolution.
Okay.
Yeah. And so you don't throw everything out the window,
No,
but certainly,
It's over time.
yeah, well, Dickie and Ajay are coming, so I want to keep going.
Okay, well, you should announce that.
Yeah, I'm going to keep going because I do not want to have to come back to this.
Dickie isn't here.
Yeah, Ajay and Dickie are sick today, and I think we announced that we said that at the beginning.
Okay, well, be sure to do your own self.
Yeah.
Review on the Tibetan alphabet.
All right, so I want to now talk about this idea that what appears in the external world to us is as a dependent arising, and because it's a dependent arising, it is, you could say, mirage-like. It is, you could say, illusion-like. All right, so I want to. What do we actually see as humans? What are we actually seeing? And these are coming from this is coming from NASA and all different sources on the internet, Wikipedia, that I was looking up to sort of talk about our own personal experience and how this relates to the Prasangika view and the Chittamatra view. What we see with our eyes, actually our brain and our consciousness, which is doing it, is only a tiny band called visible light within what's called the electromagnetic spectrum, what we see with our eyes. The entire spectrum of light, electromagnetism refers to actually light. When there are all different kinds of waveforms and things, but it's referring to light. The entire spectrum of what we call light is estimated to be 0.5% of what exists in the entire universe. So the entire electromagnetic spectrum that we as humans talk about is estimated to be 0.5% of what actually exists in the universe. And the what you would call the fraction of that 0.5 that the humans are able to see, that's called visible light, is sort of like just a spear of that 0.05%. So basically we have, our eyes are only capable of taking in a very, very limited bandwidth of what's called visible light in the electromagnetic spectrum. So since we were born, we've been seeing things that appear to be out there, but we're only seeing what our eyes are capable of decoding from the very small, the fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum that our eyes are capable to take in. That makes sense, right?
Yep.
All right. So from that sliver of electromagnetic visible light, we have decided what our world is, how it exists, how it looks, how it appears, and how things work. That's how we gather our information about the world. Though our sun's visible light appears white to us, it is really the combined light of individual rainbow colors. When, again, go back to Isaac Newton, he did this experiment with a prism where the white light from the sun went through a prism, and then it came out as all these rainbow colors. Then he took the experiment again, he added to it, had another prism, put the rainbow colors into the prism, and then they came back out white light. So within this white light is contained this spectrum of colors that goes from violet to red.
Right.
Now, this is what the Buddhist flags, the prayer flags, what they are actually, those colors in the house. They're referring to this spectrum and the different frequencies of that have to do. This is why movie The Wizard of Oz is so
Right.
inspired when they're talking about going beyond the rainbow,
Rainbow.
over the rainbow, beyond what the spectrum is that this narrow
That we
spectrum
can
that we
see.
have.
Right.
We decode this small band of visible light into the objects that appear to us and that we identify and label as the external world we see. Many species on the planet even
Mhm.
see light frequencies that humans don't see. That's outside the visible human spectrum. When you actually go into it, it's incredible what some like eagles and hawks and things like that, what they can see, what their eyes do, and the way bees see,
Yeah.
the way houseflies see, it's quite different than humans.
Mhm.
So in other words, based on what the eye organ is,
Mhm.
there's a different appearance.
Right.
So in that sense, what's appearing to us is illusion-like, dependent arisings. Here, Lama Zopa said this, because what we have is fields of frequency that are out there, and we're only able to decode a very small part of that. So Lama Zopa says, when you look at, say, a table, Lama Zopa would say, the table exists to us, it appears to us as a table. He said, but what is actually there is so subtle. What's actually going on in the frequencies is so subtle that it might as well be like an illusion, what's appearing to us, because it's only a fraction of what is actually there is appearing to us. This is science. This is not Prasangika or Chittamatra. This is actual science talking. All right, let's go now to what do we actually hear. We're going through the senses. In humans, sound waves enter into the ear and reach the eardrum. So we're having, again, frequencies, waves coming in and going into the eardrum. These sound waves set the thin main membrane of the eardrum in motion, causing vibration through the middle ear bones and then into a membrane within the inner ear and the hair cells that are attached to it. This produces streams of pulses in the nerve fibers, which are transmitted through auditory pathways to the brain. Our brain then decodes these pulses of vibration into sounds that we identify and label as what we hear in the external world. So based on the equipment we have, the body we have, the kind of brain we have, the organs we have, we are decoding this field of frequency out there in a very particular way. And then we identify it and label it as different kinds of things. For instance, we, as yet, do not decode Wi-Fi. The only way we decode Wi-Fi is through something like a computer or a phone or something like that, which actually decodes Wi-Fi. The Wi-Fi is going through these fields of energy that are all around us, but we're not picking that up because we have a very limited range. The way we pick up, but the computer, just the way the computer is able to pick up the Wi-Fi, and then there's a picture there. And we would think of the picture as being actually inside the computer. Well, the picture that the human brain and mind is picking up, the ears, the senses, is inside. And in that sense, the Chittamatra is correct. Prasangika is not disagreeing. Not disagreeing. What the appearance is actually occurring inside. And then it's sort of like projected out. We see it as external. There is something there, like Lama Zopa said, there's something out there, but it's so subtle. The various frequencies are so subtle, it might as well be like an illusion. So, and then again, there are species of animals that hear frequencies that are way beyond what humans can hear. We all know this. I mean, dogs can hear higher pitches than we can, dolphins, whales, elephants, they all hear things that we can't hear.
Right.
Because they have different equipment that is able to pick up frequencies that our equipment doesn't pick up. What do we actually smell, taste, and touch? For humans, smell occurs when chemical compounds bind to receptors within the nasal cavity, transmitting a signal through the olfactory system where the sensory input is processed by parts of the brain, which decode the chemical compounds into odors that we identify and label as smells in the external world. But again, it is happening internally. We are decoding chemical compounds, and we are decoding them as smells that we say are out there, and then we label them and define them. And an interesting thing about smells is that they trigger our memory. When we will smell something, it will remind us of when we smelled that. So it's actually connected. It's connected to different parts of the brain. Also the same thing. When we see something, it will remind us. It will trigger our memory. So all of this stuff is all connected within our neural pathways in the brain and all in the body. The perception of flavor, when we're talking about taste, the perception of flavor, and this is a combination of things. It's a combination of auditory, taste, touch, and smell sensory information. Smell plays the biggest role in the sensation of flavor. When we chew, the tongue manipulates food to release the smell, and these smells enter the nasal cavity. The smell of food has the sensation of being in the mouth during the process of chewing. The human tongue can only distinguish 5 qualities of taste, which is something like sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and pungent, or something like that. But the nose can distinguish among hundreds and hundreds of smells. And so that's why we can have such diversified taste. It's these sense organs working together, and then it goes to the brain, and then our consciousness, awareness, which is infused with all of this body. Then the consciousness and awareness and the mental consciousness labels, defines, decides whether it's good or bad. This, I love the taste of this, I hate the taste of that, and it's different for everybody. Although most people like ice cream. You know, really.
Yeah. That sugar, man.
So are you getting a sense that similar, very similar to the Chittamatrin view, that all these external appearances are happening in the mind? It's not, they're not wrong. Prasangika is not disagreeing with that aspect of Chittamatra. Prasangika is disagreeing with the idea that the mind itself is this inherently independent, self-existing entity. And the same with touch. It's neural structures that go through the body, then into the spinal cord, then into the brain, and then we experience touch. All right. We are experiencing a kind of virtual reality. Consciousness or awareness in its prime state cannot pick up objects or sit in a chair, just as 2 radio stations on different wavelengths cannot connect. We therefore experience human reality through a vehicle called a body, which does match the frequency band of human reality and can interact with it. The 5 senses and systems of the body decode information from this frequency field and produce the experience of the physical world. So again, the experience of the physical world is a decoded experience from the fields of, you would say, energy that are existing out there throughout the universe. The 5 senses decode frequencies of waveform information through the antenna we call eyes, ears, skin, nose, and tongue, transforms them into electrical signals which are communicated to the brain. Yeah, so this is what we're talking about. So here's the main difference. This is where we close. The main difference between Chittamatra and Prasangika. For the most part, the view that we experience reality as it is perceived within our mind, similar to the way that it was just described, that how science is describing it, is shared. That view is shared by both the Chittamatrins and the Prasangikas. So it goes to your question. It's not lost. It's not like you throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
Yeah.
this is why last week Khenpo Sangye Dorje was saying there's a lot in Chittamatra that's correct. You don't want to throw that out. Okay.
Yeah.
The main difference between Chittamatra and Prasangika is that the Chittamatrins assert that the mind, the consciousness itself, is inherently self-existent, whereas the Prasangikas assert that the mind or consciousness is a dependent arising that is empty of inherent existence. The Chittamatra view, if it were correct, would ultimately lead to permanent isolation. For a truly and inherently self-existent entity could not possibly be related to or dependent upon anything other than itself. That's just logic.
Right.
So if you follow the Chittamatra view logically, it ends up in isolation. On the other hand, the Prasangika view will ultimately lead to expansion and interconnectedness with an energy field of consciousness and an ever-changing mind and body that has the potential to become the expression of infinite wisdom and awareness for the benefit of all beings. And that's just that one little difference makes all the difference.
One little big difference.
One little big difference. And that's why ultimately the Chittamatra view, that particular view of inherently existing mind, self-existing mind, we have to let go of it. And this is just going to take practice for us, because since beginningless time, we've held on to that. We hold that view, that we exist independently.
Right.
It's sort of like innate. We would think it's like born, we come that way. So it's going to take practice. Basically, every day, in part of my practice, one of the things I say every day is, I will abandon the conception of an inherently existent I and mine. And over 10 years, I've been saying that every day. At some point, that begins to sink into your consciousness, so that you start to actually sort of think that way. And that's all habits are.
Right.
You just do something, you repeat it over and over. Just make sure what you're doing and repeating is something that's going to be beneficial.
Right.
Stop repeating the things, stop repeating all of the anger.
Right.
Stop repeating all of the grasping attachment to things. It can be quite difficult. It's going to take time, because we're so practiced in the wrong way.
Conditioned.
Right.
Yes. So this is our job, to change that, to change our habits into habits that are going to be productive and helpful, not just for ourselves, but for everyone. All right, so we're done. And we say our closing prayers. We finished. And in our old time frame, we finished on time. Okay, final dedication, which is on page 3 of these prayers. Wait a minute. No, let's go to page 2, the dedication prayers. Let's say them in English. May the precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore. May the view of emptiness, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore. And again, this is a case of simply repeating these words on a daily basis, over and over the years. If you repeat these words, eventually the meaning of these words are going to sort of click with you.
Right.
It will go into your consciousness, and it will become part of the way you think and part of your aspiration. But it's going to take time, and it's going to take doing it.
Right.
This is called practice.
Right.
We have to practice. You don't learn how to be, an NBA star without practicing,
Right.
shooting the ball into the hoop. You don't learn how to be, a Vladimir Horowitz without practicing the piano.
Right.
You can't, it requires practice, and you don't travel the path to enlightenment without practicing it. So we must practice. It's extremely important. All right, and then the final dedication, which was on page 3, and also in English. And this is a good one to start all the time too. In all my lives, may I not be separated from true lamas, and so enjoy the splendor of Dharma, fully perfecting the virtues and levels and paths. May I speedily attain the state of Vajradhara. And Vajradhara is like primordial, the primordial Buddha. Okay,
Thank you.
thank you, everybody.
And thank you, everyone, for
Thank
tolerating
you,
my
Christopher.
desire to play with pop.
You're welcome. See you guys next time, and we'll move on. We'll move on to
Yes,
something.
yes.
I'm not sure what. I think this next thing, there's more sex involved, so you all want to show up. Okay.
Is that how we're doing?